You're listening to Bona Fide Needs, Season 3, Episode 6. Hi, and welcome back to the Bona Fide Needs podcast. I'm Craig LaChance, Editor-in-Chief of the PubK Group. The Bona Fide Needs listener demographic spans many generations, so I'm sure some of our listeners remember the mood ring fad of the 1970s. If you're unfamiliar with this fragment of cultural detritus, allow me to enlighten you. Mood rings were rings you wore on your finger. They contained thermochromic crystals that changed color in response to temperature. The idea was that a person's body temperature changes with their emotional state. So if someone was wearing a mood ring, the crystals in the mood ring would change color based on their mood. Thus, the ring's color at any given moment would be a snapshot of what the wearer was feeling. Needless to say, mood rings were more of a new agey fad than an accurate measurement of someone's emotional state. Nevertheless, and bear with me here, I think the idea of a mood ring is a good analogy for the National Defense Authorization Act. Every year, Congress must pass the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. The NDAA establishes the budget and policy priorities for the Department of Defense. The NDAA sets the funding for defense programs, rules on military policy, details on programs, and oversight measures. Like a mood ring, each NDAA is a snapshot of the vibes in the world of defense contracting. The bill adjusts budget priorities based on what's happening in the world and current military needs. If there's a new threat or a new technology, you're going to see its impact in NDAA funding and policies. Thus, the NDAA, like a mood ring, is a constantly evolving reflection of the military's mood. It is therefore essential for defense contractors to get a sense of the NDAA's color shifts each year. As of this recording in July 2024, the House and Senate have each introduced bills for the 2025 NDAA. Joining me today to assess the colors of this year's legislation are defense and policy experts from Arnold and Porter, Marne Marotta, Adrienne Jackson, and Sara Linder. Marne, Adrienne, and Sara, welcome to the podcast. Let's take a moment to introduce you to our listeners.
Hi, I'm Marne Marotta. I'm a managing director at Arnold and Porter in the legislative group, and I focus on tech and trade policy.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Jackson, a senior policy specialist in the legislative practice group at Arnold and Porter, and I focus on defense and tech issues.
Hi, and I'm Sara Linder, policy advisor in the legislative practice, and I work in the defense space as well as federal funding and education policy. Great to be here.
Thank you all for joining us today. So let's start out. Maybe you can tell me what's the current status of the NDAA and where do we stand with the bills in the House and the Senate?
Thanks, Craig. This is Sara. I'm happy to jump in and start with where we're at currently on the House side. So the National Defense Authorization Act for 64 consecutive years has been the bill that is always seen as a must-pass piece of legislation that provides the policy and authorization for defense spending. And similar to other years, the process really gets kicked off at the beginning of the first quarter with members receiving requests from stakeholders to help shape the development of the legislation. In May, the House Armed Services Committee passed overwhelmingly 57-1 their bill, which is the Service Member Quality of Life Investments Act, HR 8070. From there, that bill, after being amended with hundreds of amendments during the committee process, moved to the House floor for consideration. Notably, on the House side, given the margins with Republican control to enable the bill passage, similar to last year, we saw the bill really shift to the right with the consideration of a number of Republican amendments, really focusing on some controversial policy issues that touched on reproductive health, DE&I issues, and also targeting some of the administration's actions relating to climate. So at the end of the day, the vote on the House floor was 217 to 199, with only attracting 6 Democrats who voted for the bill. This was something that happened last year and was not incredibly surprising, but now it stands to the Senate side to move on their respective bill. And I'll turn it over to Adrienne to talk a little bit about where we are on that chamber.
Thanks, Sarah. The Senate Armed Services Committee passed its version of the NDAA in committee in mid-June by a vote of 22-3. Interestingly enough, for the first time that I've seen at least, Senator Jack Reed, the chairman of the committee, voted against passing the bill out of committee into the floor. According to staff that were present, this was shocking to many, even those on the Democratic side of the dais. But he reasoned in his press release that he had to vote against the bill due to the increased spending that's present in the Senate version, which goes over the agreed upon budget caps. This was a $25 billion increase that we see in the Senate version for the top line spending for DoD and related programs versus the House, who did stick to the spending cap restrictions. So we're now hearing from staff that Senator Reed and his committee staff are working to prepare a bipartisan, fully vetted single managers package of amendments to pass on the Senate floor before August recess. It's unclear at this time if Senator Schumer will allow for even that small procedural hurdle and that small amount of time on the floor for the Senate NDAA. Typically, we would see about a week and a half of floor action for the Senate NDAA, where all 100 senators get to make amendments and have a say on the defense policy bill. But it doesn't seem like there's time for that this year, with judicial nominations and a child online safety bill being the priority of Majority Leader Schumer at this time, with only a week before August recess. So we'll see if the manager's package is at least able to pass, so that some members off of the Armed Services Committee get a say on this year's defense bill. But at this time, it's a little uncertain. At some point, they will move forward with either a modified with the manager's package or the unmodified committee passed version and move to conference with the House version. It seems like we're going to move forward without the formal floor process this year, which the Senate has done the last 2 to 3 years. So we have precedent for it. And like I said, it's likely that that's what will end up happening. And then we'll see the committee, Hask staff, begin hammering out the differences between the two in August recess, which is always a good time for Sask and Hask staff to begin that process, so that when the members return in September, they are able to move on some of the more controversial items in the bill at a member level.
Okay, so what are some of the provisions in the bills that government contractors should be aware of?
Thanks, Craig. With this year, again, we're seeing some interest from the Senate and the House to change some of the policies that will affect government contractors. In the Senate version, Section 851 will require the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy to publish all non-sensitive information regarding granted acquisition waivers on a new public DoD website. This will increase transparency and further congressional policy surrounding that. Also, in the Senate version, there's Section 850, which creates a National Defense Executive Reserve, where the Secretary of Defense will enter into voluntary agreements with defense contractors that are interested to advise the Secretary of Defense on the health of the industrial base and steps that could be taken to further enhance the DoD industrial base. And those will be both traditional and non-traditional defense contractors that are invited to that table. And then in the House version, Section 809D creates a review panel on fair and reasonable pricing and contract oversight of sole source contracts that amount to over $10 million for munitions and weapons systems. And this includes related contracts for services and spare parts. Section 812 of the House version would require offerors for a purchase order. So this is adding purchase order to this part of DFARS to submit cost or pricing data before award. It allows the Department of Defense to look at historical data of recent prices paid on purchase orders to consider whether the current offered price is considered fair and reasonable, but it does allow for them to take inflation into account. Section 813 in the House version would eliminate the late cost and pricing data submission defense for contractors. So certainly something I'm sure some people will want to keep an eye on. And then moving from there into more specific provisions, both the HASC and SASC NDAAs reflect congressional concern that the PRC continues to challenge the security and economic interests of the United States and increasingly has the ability to do so. So we're going to outline a few provisions that are specific to the government contract world, but also reflect that concern against China. So in the Senate version, they fully authorize the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and require a plan for the establishment of joint force headquarters in the Indo-PACOM in Japan and Australia, and require a review of the entire military logistics network in the Indo-Pacific and a plan to address any deficiencies, which we could see impacting government contractors who have work in that space. Specifically, Section 853 would require the Secretary of Defense to revise the DFARS to ensure that federal contractors that also conduct software development in China are required to report software vulnerabilities by China within 48 hours to the Department of Defense. And then Section 854 of the Senate version requires the Secretary of Defense to seek domestic manufacture of essential pharmaceuticals that are sourced from a foreign adversary such as China. And then moving over to the House version, there is Section 802, which would prohibit federal contracts with companies that lobby for Chinese military companies. This follows some of the policies that we've seen in the news from Defense Hawk offices who refuse to meet with lobbying firms that represent these types of clients. It also builds on the consulting company restriction language that we saw in the FY24 NDAA that certainly affected a few government contractors. And that's it for the China restrictions. Marne, do you want to talk about AI?
Yes, absolutely. In the AI space, this is one of the few areas that we're going to see some provisions that can actually pass and get signed into law related to artificial intelligence. So everyone is watching the space very closely. The House and Senate have very different approaches to how they want to start to legislate around AI. But I think the good news here is that both of them seem to want to advance AI adoption in the Defense Department in various defense applications, and they want to strengthen funding for acquisition of AI and for the use of AI in acquisition. For example, in the House, Section 1512 would direct the Defense Department to develop a joint partner sharing network that leverages AI decision-making. And the Senate takes a little bit of a different approach. They would have a pilot program to optimize AI-enabled software for workflow and operations of DoD depots, shipyards, and manufacturing facilities. But this is an area that we actually think that some of the AI provisions will get into the final bill, and it could create some additional opportunities for DoD contractors. Certainly a space that we're watching very carefully. There are lots of provisions, but I don't think it makes sense to go through all of them in detail, but those are kind of the two biggest ones that I think are the best takeaways.
I'm happy to touch on some of the small business provisions that are in the House and Senate bills. These are a little less sticky than some of the other policies relating to China and the ones we've touched on earlier. There's some differences and also some similarities in the House and Senate bill. One of the things that is in both the House and Senate versions, there's provision on streamlining access for small businesses and non-traditional defense contractors to have access to shared classified commercial infrastructure, which is a way to help reduce costs and administrative requirements and increase those opportunities for those types of entities who need access to perform work in secured facilities to have those opportunities to really compete for classified contracts. These pilots would run through 2030. So we're likely to see that retained in a final bill, given that, it's already in both the House and Senate versions. A few differences in the House. There is some provisions aimed at improving contracting burdens for small businesses that work with DoD. So for example, there's a provision in the House bill that improves information sharing between DoD and small businesses on contracting opportunities with a focus particularly on DoD critical technology areas. That's a space of real investment for DoD and a new opportunity, particularly to get involved for small businesses involved in the tech space. There's also in the House bill a requirement for DoD to issue contract solicitations that are more clear and concise and accessible for contractors, and some new contracting goals focused on veteran-owned small businesses and increasing training around those contracts to small businesses that are owned by service-disabled vets. On the Senate side, we see a number of different pilots. There's one that focuses on tracking the number of awards that are provided to small businesses and non-traditional defense contractors via transactional authorities, including those that are a part of consortia. And that's to help better understand the industrial base implications of using those OTAs. Another thing that I just wanted to flag, which is an interesting addition in the Senate, is there's a Small Business Bill of Rights, Section 862. And that's to help small businesses resolve customer service issues and complaints that relate to acquisitions to help get those matters addressed and resolved more expeditiously.
All right, so that's excellent. Are there any pending amendments we should be keeping an eye on as these bills make their way through Congress?
So there's actually two provisions that I wanted to highlight. One of the pending amendments on the Senate side is various forms of contracting prohibitions on certain entities in China. One is the Biosecure Act. That's gotten a lot of ink out there. That is a very controversial provision that would have very broad implications for the biotech industry. So that's one that people are watching very closely. The other thing that I would mention is there is a provision included in both the House and the Senate NDAAs that kind of took everybody off guard. It's a right to repair provision that doesn't necessarily make sense in the NDAA, but the reason it's there, it's the must-pass bill that has to get passed at the end of the year, and this is one of the few vehicles that's moving this year. So it's become a very attractive target for these kinds of provisions. The right to repair is this movement that has spent several years trying to ensure that once you purchase a good, you are able to repair it yourself, that you do not have to pay to get it repaired or have to take it to a specific place to get it repaired. But this is really a provision that's aimed at the commercial market. This is not something that's really aimed at the Defense Department. The House version of the bill includes a provision that would study whether it would make sense to have a right to repair provision included in all DoD contracts. The Senate goes a step further, and it actually includes a provision that says the Defense Department can't enter into any procurement contract unless the contractor agrees in writing to provide the Department of Defense fair and reasonable access to all repair materials, including parts, tools, information, and anything used by the manufacturer or provider or their authorized partners to diagnose, maintain, or repair the goods or services. Again, this is a provision that really applies to the commercial market, but what we've seen in the past is provisions that become part of the defense contracting world, spread to the federal contracting world, and then spread to the commercial contracting world. So this isn't really a defense side issue to deal with, but it is one that we're going to be watching very closely because there are a lot of interested parties that have a lot of concerns about these provisions. Another thing I would just say is contracting. This is, as I just mentioned, the contracting, this is a this is kind of where we see changes start, is in the Defense Authorization Act, and increasingly with fewer vehicles that are moving through Congress, this is a very attractive target for any changes, whether it's China related or any other kinds of provisions.
So, what are the big debates that you see these bills move forward? What do you think are going to be the sticking points between the House and the Senate?
Thanks, Craig. Yes, we're going to see a lot of the same controversial personnel debates this year, I think. While these might not directly affect some of our listeners, it will certainly affect timing of passage, so it is of note. The Senate version would require women to join the Selective Service. It would also restrict Pentagon diversity programs, such as the DEI office, and ban transgender healthcare services at Defense Department facilities, both of which, like I said, we saw last year as part of a heavy debate. They were included in the House version, but ultimately not included in the final. The Senate version also includes a provision that would prohibit the resettlement of Gaza or West Bank refugees in the United States. Obviously, right now, a very, very hot topic and hotly contested item. These provisions were able to pass as amendments in the committee conference due to the help of Senator Manchin, who brought that Democratic vote over to the Republican side and helped the Sask Republicans get these into the final committee version. On the House side, they include those DEI hiring freeze measures, as well as the ban on covering gender transition medical procedures. But the language between the two versions are different enough to where they will be quote unquote conferenceable this summer and fall between the two Senate and House versions. The House also includes the measure to block the Biden administration policy that reimburses service members for the travel costs incurred when receiving an abortion. Again, we saw this last year. And like I said, I think that all of these are going to be the provisions that are the final ones debated and could be the ones that make final passage a little bit delayed this winter.
Okay, well, let me ask you now to get out your crystal balls and make some predictions about where you all think we are headed over the next few months with the NDAA.
Happy to kick us off. And in terms of predictions, I think that just as we have seen over the last 64 years, this will be another year where we do see final passage of the NDAA as one of the few must-pass bills for the year ends and Congress concludes. It'll be certainly passed more likely than not in the lame duck after the November elections are held. So as we head into the conference process, one of the things that is worth taking a look at to see where the administration stands is in their statement of administration policy on the House and Senate bills. They haven't released their statement of administration policy yet on the Senate version, given where we are. But on June 11th, shortly before the House passed its NDAA bill, it released its position. At that point in time, they had expressed support for the passage of the legislation. This was prior, notably, to a number of Republican added amendments that the administration is unlikely to be supportive of. But as it relates to government contracting issues that are called out specifically in the statement, I'll highlight a few of those. One area of concern that they reference is in regards to the House Section 812 on price history exception to certified pricing data. So this provision limits DoD's ability to require prime contractors to obtain certified costs of pricing data from subcontractors below $5 million. Currently, that level is set at $2 million. And the argument here that the administration has issue with is that it takes away an incentive for sole source prime contractors to negotiate with their subs on reining in costs. Another area that they highlight in their concerns is their opposition to the House Section 871 on requiring approvals at the level of a deputy secretary at the agency to exercise a waiver for certain conflicts of interest under federal acquisition regulations. They don't believe that this is the level of scrutiny is necessary at the Department of Secretary position, and it's something they want to see revised in conference. There's a whole laundry list of 8 pages of additional provisions of concern, some of those ranging from the proposed new drone corps that is outlined in the House bill, restrictions on the START Treaty, DE&I, climate regs, and also Guantanamo Bay restrictions. Regardless of whether the bills enjoy strong bipartisan support, you will always see a number of different provisions that are at odds with the administration. So those are just some things to watch to see how they evolve in conference, given the position of the stance of the administration right now. And I'll turn over to Adrienne and Marne to talk a little bit about election and kind of path ahead.
Thanks, Sarah. Without diving too deep into the very interesting presidential election news that we're seeing right now, I do think that how it impacts the NDAA is pretty minimal. Any year that we have a presidential election, it does mean more recess, which means less time for Congress to have floor activity for the NDAA. So members are expected to be out for most of October, but I don't think that this will impact final passage for the NDAA. I actually think it will be the only bill that the election does not impact. I think we'll end up seeing final passage in December, which is the trend we have seen over the last several years. But as Sarah and Marne have both mentioned, the NDAA has passed now for 60 plus years, and I don't think this is going to be the year we break that streak. Marne, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm going to be a little bit of a naysayer here and just mention that this is an interesting year is an understatement. It is an unprecedented year. And so things that don't normally happen seem to happen. So I'm going to just put out there that there is a small caveat that this could get pushed to early January before the new Congress starts. And the only reason I'm saying this is everything else that has gone wrong that has not got on time has done that this year. And so just to say that I think there's a small chance of that happening, but at the end, I do think this passes, and I'm talking like January 2nd, not later in the year. But that I put at a very small percentage too. This is usually the sweetener vote that members take right before they leave for the holiday recess. And so I think the other thing we can watch is just how the funding debate goes and whether if the funding goes into December or into January. And I think that'll give us a little bit more sense of what to expect in this unexpected year.
Yeah, that's a good point, Marne. And I think I'll add too, I do think we're headed for, on the funding side, a continuing resolution, which will impact some of our listeners as we're held to the fiscal year 2024 numbers, if that is what happens. So we'll see. I think it's good that you said that. I think it's very true that is a possibility, but I always like to think that the NDAA gets to be the one exception to the rule, but we will see.
We'll just jump in to add to conclude, obviously a must watch is what's the top line number going to be in the final NDAA. Obviously on the Senate side, it's 25 billion over the president's budget request of 912 versus the House version that is at 884 billion. I'm hearing from folks on the Hill that they will go up to the Senate level is what the hope is, and they'd like to exceed that. But, we'll, of course, wait and see how the elections might influence perhaps where they land on that top line figure.
And just because it's on everyone's minds recently, I just wanted to note that in light of the Loper Bright decision that we got down earlier this month, Loper Bright is one area that's going to affect almost every piece of legislation. It's certainly an area that people are going to be looking at the NDAA to make sure that there are very specific grants of authorities to the Defense Department to issue new regulations. And this is just a new area that we're going to have to evaluate going forward. So this may be a very different podcast next year.
Thanks again to Marne, Adrienne, and Sara for that informative discussion. That's it for this episode of Bona Fide Needs. To keep up with government contracting and legal developments every day, subscribe to PubK at pubkgroup.com. For additional expert analysis and insights, you can find multiple timely and informative blogs at arnoldandporter.com. Thanks for listening. You can find Bona Fide Needs on your favorite podcast platform, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, and YouTube. You can help us reach more listeners by liking, subscribing, or leaving a review. For Arnold and Porter and the PubK Group, this is Craig LaChance. Bona Fide Needs is a joint production and copyright of Arnold and Porter, providing legal advice and thought leadership for government contractors, and the PubK Group, publisher of daily news and insights for government contractors and their counsel. This podcast is produced by Craig LaChance and Tina Chen.